This is such a sad passage to read, isn't it? Abraham's just been on a really spiritual high. He was confident that he who began a good work in him would carry it on until completion, to the day of Christ Jesus. He rejoiced at seeing Jesus' day. He was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. He couldn't wait to be in heaven with Jesus. And against all the odds, he trusted in him to fulfill his mission of bringing salvation to the world through him. He believed that God could do the impossible through him. This is all that we thought about last Sunday. And as we come to this passage, it just makes us think, well, what was all that about? As much as we might appreciate world leaders that we have, some of them have really been putting their foot in it at the moment, haven't they, as far as this virus goes. They're offering up their own wisdom at times about where it came from and how to treat it and all kinds of things. But the fact of the matter is that these really aren't the areas of their expertise. And they should really just be sticking with their God-given task of leadership, leaving the rest of those details to their experts. Well, Abraham acts just like one of those world leaders in this passage, getting involved in areas where he's absolutely got no business whatsoever. The difference is, he's not just interfering with the plans and purposes of health organisations and services. He's interfering with the plans and purposes of the God of heaven. He's not just going to leave a few people red-faced through his actions. His actions threaten to derail the church and its mission when it's barely got off the ground. How does all this come about? Well, there was a severe famine in the land of Canaan. So Abraham takes the logical step of heading down to Egypt with Sarai. In just the same way as we're being led by the circumstances of the coronavirus, Abraham and Sarah were led by the circumstances of this famine. It's just the logical and God-honouring step to take for them. I mean, if we met in person at the moment, we know that we'd potentially be putting people's lives at risk by doing that. And in the same way, if Abraham and Sarai stayed in Canaan, they'd be putting their lives and the life of God's church at risk. So their temporary move to Egypt seems to be all well and good. But it's what Abraham does when he gets there that isn't all well and good at all. He knows that Egypt could well be a dangerous place for them to go. And how does he respond to that threat? Does he pray? No. He jumps to his own conclusions. Just like some of our world leaders in this pandemic, Abraham here has become an overnight expert on problems that he's facing. He says to Sarai, when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but will let you live. You see how much of an expert he's become? He knows an awful lot, doesn't he? And don't get me wrong, like our world leaders, Abraham was very wise. In fact, chapter 20 tells us that he was a prophet. The problem is that he'd stopped listening to his expert. Just as the world leaders aren't always listening to their experts at the moment and doing things like accusing the USA for creating this virus and building crazy conspiracy theories and things like that. Well, Abraham here had stopped listening to his expert, to God. God had promised him that he would be a great nation and that he would bless those who bless him and curse those that curse him. In that promise, Abraham had an absolute assurance of God's protection. He knew that if anybody messed with him, they'd have God to answer to. He was going to become a great nation, and that made it impossible for anyone to take his life. He might have been a prophet, but he let his fear of the Egyptians mess with his head at this time. He's completely taken his eye off the promise of God and the God who's given it to him. His fears led him to a total abandonment of his faith in God. And because he allowed himself to jump to this godless and bizarre conclusion, he went on to make a bizarre and godless plan. Instead of looking to the Lord to protect him and provide for them as they went to Egypt, Abraham took matters into his own hands and told Sarai to tell anyone in Egypt that asked that she was Abraham's sister. That way, Abraham concludes, he'll be treated well and his life will be spared. Now that statement that Abraham asked Sarai to say was half true because chapter 20 tells us that Sarai was his half-sister. But as his wife, surely she's become just a little bit more to him than that, a little bit more important. And his role to her as her protector is surely a lot bigger as well. I mean, if a suitable candidate comes along and wants to marry your sister, you can't really get in the way of that, can you? But if they want to marry your wife, well, that's a different story entirely, isn't it? But for Abraham, making Sarah take the cover identity of his sister and then giving her up to another lover was a fair exchange for his life and his welfare. This is desperate and pretty sick stuff that's coming out of Abraham's head right now. He says to her, my life will be spared because of you. And we're just screaming at the page, aren't we? No, Abraham, your life will be spared because of Jesus, because he is with you and he has promised to fulfill his purposes through you. That's all the guarantee of safety that he needs. In this passage, Abraham's like, me. But what about his wife? What about Sarai? What he should have said to Sarai, the faith that he should have displayed is easy in hindsight, but he had just received the blessing of God in the previous chapter. So what he really should have said to Sarai is something like, well, this famine's forcing us to go down to Egypt, which could be very dangerous for us, as someone might want to try and steal you away from me and kill me in the process. But God knows what's happening. He knows we have no other choice to leave or we're going to starve in Canaan. Now, I've got no idea what he's doing in this or how we're going to get through this situation, but he's obviously in total control of it. And he'll protect us because he's chosen to make us a key part in bringing his blessing and forgiveness to the whole world. So we're going to head down to Egypt, okay, Sarai? And we'll head down hand in hand as husband and wife. Let's do this together. But that's not what he does. What does he do? Instead, he turned his worst fears into a self-fulfilling prophecy. He was afraid that they'd see that she was beautiful. And guess what? They saw that she was beautiful. He wanted her to tell them that she was his sister, so that his life would be spared and he'd been treated well. And she did tell them that she was his sister. And when she was promised praise to Pharaoh, she was taken into his palace as his wife, and Abraham was treated well for Sarai's sake. As her brother, he was given loads of sheep, cattle, donkeys, camels, and servants, and gold and silver we read later on as well. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Abraham thought he knew what was going to happen, and because of that, he planned for it, and it did happen. But at rock bottom, this was a shocking and cowardly betrayal of his wife. He's put Sarai in harm's way in order to protect and prosper himself. You'll remember from the start of the year now how Adam threw Eve under the bus, didn't he? When the Lord confronted him about their rebellion, he pretty much said, well, she made me do it. It's her fault that I did it. You put her here with me and she made me do it. Well, Abraham rivals him here in his abandonment of his loving and protective role as a husband. But like Eve, Sarai is going to be the one who births this hope into the world. She should be incredibly precious in Abraham's sight. His highest priority and protection at this time should be with her. But she wasn't his highest priority. He was his highest priority. And we can almost picture Abraham in this passage, surrounded by his great wealth that Abraham had given to him, feet up, beer in hand, watching the box, thinking, oh, well, all's fair in love and war as long as I'm all right. But God did not agree at all with that estimation. He's not pleased with this arrangement at all. The Lord lets Pharaoh know of his displeasure as well, of him taking Sarai as his wife. And he does that by inflicting a serious illness on his whole house. Even if Sarai was somehow dispensable in Abraham's eyes, God had made her indispensable in his. She was an equal part of this plan and this blessing that he'd given to Abraham. God had promised to bring about the body of the church, Israel, and the head of the church, Christ, through Abraham's family. As we saw on Thursday, he's not the God of plan Bs. He always keeps his promises. He does not change his mind from one day to the next. So if Sarai's taken out of this equation, the birth of the church and a saviour simply isn't going to happen. So God intervenes. He intervenes in order to protect his people and in order to preserve his promise. He gets Sarah out of Pharaoh's harem and restores her back to her rightful place as the mother-to-be of the great nation of Israel. Abraham's concerns and his plans to save himself couldn't have been any worse thought through. And they couldn't have been any further from the truth. Instead of him dying at the hand of the Egyptians, the total opposite happens. And Mr. Egypt himself comes close to death. The question, you see, wasn't how were Abraham and Sarah going to survive and how they would survive the Egyptians, but and their might. I'm going to start that sentence again. The question wasn't how Abraham and Sarai were going to survive the Egyptians and their might, but how the Egyptians were going to survive them and their God. Forget about Abraham's fear of what they might do to him. Pharaoh summons him and he says, "What have you done to me?" And that's a great and probing question, isn't it? Remember, Abraham was a prophet. God regularly revealed his plans to him just as he had in chapter 12. And if he'd been praying and listened to God as he should have been, and if he'd been doing that before, that would have been the best place to do it, wouldn't it? Before he'd made these decisions, or even during the decision-making process, this whole unfortunate event wouldn't have taken place. The message from God would have been loud and clear and very similar to Pharaoh's words. What have you done? What are you thinking? Pharaoh is baffled and angry at Abraham's sinful plan. And he barrages him with questions of what, why, and why. And he doesn't need any answer. He just seems disgusted that Abraham sold out his wife in such a way. He says, why? Why didn't you tell me? She was your wife. Why did you say she's my sister? So I took her to be my wife. Well, we know the answer to that question. It's because Abraham's well-being was more important to him than Sarai's well-being. But in his questions, Pharaoh is essentially dropping here the bombshell that he wouldn't have actually touched Sarai if he knew that she was Abraham's wife. The moment it clicks when you've been an absolute fool isn't pleasant. And Abraham's foolishness is written down for us all to see and to learn from in this passage. After this, Pharaoh tells him to go. And he leaves with his tail between his legs, having been rebuked and corrected by someone who doesn't even know Jesus. As far as his God-given go and bless the world with the gospel mission goes, Abraham's been 100% failure. Instead, he's told to go and take away the stench of sin and death that he's brought upon Egypt with him. This has been a humiliating and counterproductive experience for Abraham. He just fearlessly paraded his faith around the densely populated land of Canaan, calling upon the name of the Lord as an expression of his faith in the gospel promises that had been given him. He just left his homeland, hadn't he, and walked away from his family, self-sacrificially laying down his life to follow Jesus. And now he's selfishly watching his own back, hiding behind his wife for the fear of the Egyptians. Where has his tremendous faith gone? God was going to bless the world through his offspring. How could even the might of Pharaoh get in the way of that blessing? This wasn't the faith that we saw in Abraham last week, was it? After such high expectations, we see him fall at the first hurdle. After such inspiring faith, we now see breathtaking sin. And isn't that the case in our lives sometimes as well? After an incredible spiritual high, we're on top of the world with Jesus. We're on fire for him and enjoying him. We take a massive nosedive and fall away from him head first into sin. Well, after Abraham had pressed the self-destruct button in Egypt, he walks away, leaving the rubble of the gospel on the floor and the stench of sin and death in the air. He couldn't fix the mess that he'd caused. All he could do is start to look to the one who could. And that's what he did. He headed back to the place where he'd come from, back to Bethel and Ai. And when he gets there, he calls again on the name of the Lord. He's looking to him for the favor and forgiveness that he so desperately needs right now. But oh boy, Abraham is running back to the Father after he's nearly derailed the church and its mission. What happens when he finally talks to his expert, asking for forgiveness for not seeking his advice? Now, you'd expect a parent advisory notice in the Bible at this point, wouldn't you? Saying if you've got children in the room right now, you want to ask them to leave because this is going to get pretty nasty. Surely Abraham's going to get a massive whooping at this time. You'd expect God to say, you've let yourself down, you've let Sarai down, you've let the land of Egypt down, and quite frankly, you've let me down as well. You'd expect him to tear up the promise that he'd given to him in his face and say, go back to her, just go back to her. I'll choose someone else who's more worthy than you are, who's going to pick up the pieces of your mess and bring my blessing to the world. But the crazy thing is, God doesn't do any of those things. When Abraham runs back to him in repentance and faith, God just forgives him. And he gives him a fresh start, just like that. He's got away with it, seemingly scot-free. To be honest, the Lord's grace towards him is kind of hard to stomach as we look at these verses. How can God just accept and forgive and restore him just like that? Why doesn't he choose? Why doesn't he choose someone else who's more worthy of this mission? Well, quite simply because there is no one else who's more worthy. Like everyone else in the world at that time and in the world ever since, Abraham's just a normal, sinful guy. Jesus is the only one who's going to accomplish all that's been promised to him. See, our hope isn't in Abraham. He'll let us down time and time again. Our hope is in his hope. It's in his Christ, in the one who'd found him in the land of Ur, pulled him away from his idol worship, forgiven his sins, and given him a place in heaven and a message of hope of the same for the whole world. I regret times when I failed in my witness as well. Whether that's been to family, friends, colleagues, or at church. I've royally messed up in all of those departments at one time or another. And I'm sure that we could all tell tales of our stupidity for hours upon hours on end. But that wouldn't do us, our faith, or our mission as a church much good at all. We mustn't dwell upon our mistakes. Not that we ignore them, because obviously they just happen again and again and again. But we need to confess them. We need to look to repair damaged relationships in the church. Dear, oh dear, Abraham had a lot of repair work to do with his relationship with Sarai, didn't he? After all the mess that he'd caused her and what he'd made her go through. But when we fail, our other half, or each other in the church, or those around us within the world, we can always run to Jesus. Come back to him. Drop down before him in confession of your sin. And he will forgive you, and he'll give you a fresh start with him. Maybe this week you know that you've failed somebody. You've messed up and you know that you've displeased Jesus by doing that. Well, why don't you run to him right now and ask him for his forgiveness? Maybe you've never run to Jesus before in your life, but you know that you need to run to him for the forgiveness that you need. Can I ask you right now, would you run away from your sin, turn your back on your sin and run into the arms of Jesus like Abraham did? Come to him for the forgiveness and fresh start that you need with God, and he'll give you that, just like he gave it to Abraham, just like that. The next song that we're going to sing talks about coming to Jesus just as you are, in all of your sin, broken to be mended, guilty to be pardoned. And do you know, when you do that, you'll be welcomed with open arms, just as Abraham was. Amen. Well, we're going to sing that song now, and 10 minutes after that song, let's head over to Zoom and just have a lovely time of tea and coffee together. So let's sing now and head over to Zoom in 10 minutes' time. God bless everyone.